The night had begun with a quiet certainty in the Duke of Ravensfield's heart. An old familiar certainty he wore like a perfectly tailored coat. Nothing in that ballroom could disturb the order he had spent years constructing around himself. He believed in that order as one believes in winter. It always returned, it always protected, and it always kept unwanted warmth at a distance. And yet, as he descended the grand staircase of Ashbourne Hall, the Duke felt the first, almost imperceptible, crack in that certainty. It came not from the music or the glittering chandeliers above, nor from the swirls of silk gowns below, but from something far more disarming, an unexpected tug of restlessness he could not name. He paused on the last marble step, one hand resting on the banister, and let his gaze travel across the ballroom with an expression carved from habit, polished indifference, carefully crafted detachment. He knew precisely how they saw him. Tall, impeccable, a man whose dignity preceded him, whose silence was both shield and weapon. Women whispered about him behind their fans. Men straightened their posture when he approached. He was the Duke, and being the Duke meant control. Control over his reputation, control over his past, control over his heart, most of all. He had built that fortress long ago, and tonight he fully intended to keep its gates tightly barred. At least, that was what he believed before she walked in. It happened so quietly that many missed it. But not him. The Duke felt her presence before he truly saw her, as though some unseen shift in the room had brushed against the raw, buried edges of his memory. She entered without an announcement, without courting attention, without a single adornment meant to claim the room. And yet her silence drew the Duke's gaze with an inevitability that unsettled him. Lady Aurelia Hawthorne. He knew the shape of her name even before his mind allowed itself to form the thought. Years ago, that name had held the warm echo of innocence. Tonight it returned like a long-forgotten melody. Her gown was not extravagant, pale silver, modest, elegant. Her hair was arranged in a simple knot, a few strands loosened by what must have been the winter wind outside. She did not sparkle like the women who attempted to outshine the chandeliers. She stood as though she had no desire to compete with their brilliance. And perhaps that was her brilliance. She moved through the room slowly, not shyly, but thoughtfully, like someone returning to a place she once knew but no longer recognized. Their gazes met for a second, barely a heartbeat, and he felt the quiet shift again. Her eyes did not widen in surprise, nor did she look away with the girlish discomfort he remembered from past seasons. Instead, she acknowledged him with a calm, elegant composure. And then she looked away, not dismissively, not rudely, but with an air of finality that struck him harder than he expected. The Duke felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest, a pause, a faint, unwelcome sting, a sense of disruption. He did not appreciate being disrupted. "Your Grace," came a voice to his right. Lady Helena, draped in blue silk, offered him a reverent curtsy. "You appear distracted this evening. Is everything quite well?" "Everything is perfectly well," he replied with the cool precision that kept the world at arm's length. Yet, as she continued speaking about trivial matters, his thoughts drifted, against his will, back to Lady Aurelia, who now stood near the far edge of the ballroom. A few ladies approached her with polite smiles, and she returned their greetings with quiet warmth. She seemed different, serene, self-possessed, no longer the timid young woman who once stumbled through conversations and blushed at the slightest attention. Time had reshaped her, refined her, strengthened her. But the Duke's pride whispered its old creed, "She is of no consequence to you." He tried to listen to that voice. He truly did. And yet he found himself watching her again, not openly, not foolishly, but with an attentiveness he could not explain. Her hand brushed the edge of her gown. Her gaze lingered on a portrait above the fireplace. Her lips parted slightly, as though holding back a thought she did not dare speak. Small details. Details no one else would have noticed, but he noticed. It irritated him. He was not a man easily unsettled, and certainly not by a woman he had once overlooked without hesitation. Indeed, he had barely spoken to her in those earlier years, reminding himself that her gentle presence belonged to a world quieter than his own. She had been, in his estimation, too tender-hearted, too impressionable, too unguarded. And yet, She had also possessed those eyes. Clear, luminous, almost unbearably honest. Eyes that once lingered on him with something perilously close to admiration. He remembered that gaze, even though he had pretended he did not. His heart had not forgotten, even when his pride insisted it had. As a waltz began to play, he excused himself from Lady Helena and crossed the ballroom with the measured, deliberate gait of a man who commanded attention by nothing more than the echo of his boots on polished floors. He reached a column near the musicians, intending, so he told himself, to simply collect his composure, but he found himself facing her instead. Lady Aurelia stood only a few steps away, examining a floral arrangement on a marble pedestal. Her gloved fingers traced the edge of a white rose, as though reacquainting herself with something fragile she once feared to touch. Her profile was illuminated by the chandelier's soft glow, and the Duke felt the second fracture in his composure. He hesitated. Pride urged him to leave. Curiosity held him in place. Something deeper, dangerously close to longing, kept him silent. A gentleman passed behind her, bowing politely. She acknowledged him with a courteous nod, and then resumed studying the roses. He realized she had not yet noticed him. He could walk away. He should walk away. He almost did. But then, as though sensing the weight of his stare, Lady Aurelia slowly turned. Their eyes met again, this time without interruption. "Your Grace," she said softly. Her voice, it was different. No tremor, no hesitation, only calm assurance. He inclined his head in acknowledgement. Lady Aurelia, a pause stretched between them, long enough that he felt an absurd impulse to speak, to break the stillness, to reclaim control of the moment. But she was the one who spoke next. "It has been a long time, 3 years. 3 years and 4 months to be precise." He knew it, though he would never admit it. "Yes," he replied. "It has." Another pause. He expected her to fill it with a polite question, some socially acceptable pleasantry. But she didn't. She simply regarded him with that calm, unreadable gaze that stripped away the layers he usually hid behind. Strangely, he felt unsettled, as though she saw something he had, not granted anyone permission to see. "You are well, I trust?" she asked. "I am. I am glad." No flourish, no flattery, no attempt to please him, just truth. He searched her expression for some lingering trace of the young woman he once dismissed. But she was no longer that girl. There was poise in her stance, a quiet strength in the set of her shoulders, an unexpected steadiness in her gaze. And there it was, the third fracture, a deeper one. He cleared his throat. "I was unaware you had returned to London. I arrived only yesterday. And you chose to attend Ashbourne's winter ball as your first engagement?" She smiled, not brightly, not invitingly, but with a gentle self-possession that pressed against something fragile inside him. "I chose to come," she said, "because I no longer fear being seen." Her words struck him harder than they should have. He swallowed, slowly, carefully. "Was there ever reason to fear it?" he asked, though he knew the answer. Her eyes flickered, not with bitterness, but with truth long buried. "There was a time," she said quietly, "when disappearing felt easier." He understood the meaning beneath her words, though she did not accuse him directly. She did not need to. His stomach tightened, not with guilt, but with the faintest sting of something far more dangerous. Recognition. Recognition that he had once made her feel less than what she was. Recognition that time had not erased his role in that wound. Recognition that she had healed without him. And that somehow was unsettled him the most. Before he could respond, a familiar voice interrupted. "Aurelia!" A young lady approached, breathless with excitement. "There you are. Come. Mr. Alden has asked for your company." Mr. Alden. The name should have meant nothing to the Duke, yet it irritated him instantly. Lady Aurelia inclined her head toward the Duke, respectful, graceful, final. "It was a pleasure speaking with you, Your Grace." And then she turned. She walked away without hesitation, without lingering, without waiting for his reply. And the Duke of Ravensfield, cold, composed, untouchable, felt something inside him recoil with a sharp, unexpected ache. He watched as she joined Mr. Alden, who bowed deeply and offered her his arm. She accepted, smiling faintly, and they walked toward the far end of the ballroom together. The Duke realized his jaw had tightened. His hand, resting on the column, had curled slightly. His breath had changed, just enough to betray what he refused to feel. He straightened his posture, lifted his chin, willed the emotion away, but it did not leave, because for the first time in years, he had felt something he could not control, something that did not obey the fortress of pride he had built around his heart. He felt the first stirrings of fear, fear that the woman he once ignored had returned stronger than before, fear that she no longer looked at him the way she once had, fear that someone else might see her now, truly see her, before he gathered the courage to understand what he himself felt. And as the waltz swelled around him, as the ballroom glimmered with festive light, the Duke of Ravensfield stood in the silent storm of his own making, feeling his heart stop for the briefest, most devastating moment. The Duke of Ravensfield did not sleep that night. Not truly. He lay in his bed at Ravensfield House with the curtains drawn back, watching the pale strands of moonlight stretch across the ceiling. His valet had extinguished the candles hours earlier, and the fire in the grate had softened into a quiet glow, but the Duke's mind refused to settle into silence. It had been years since something, or rather someone, had unsettled him so deeply. He told himself that Lady Aurelia's unexpected return had merely disrupted the order of the evening, an inconvenience to the structure of his thoughts. But the truth lingered beneath every justification. She had stirred an old wound he had chosen never to confront. He turned on his side, pressing a hand beneath the pillow as though seeking a steadiness that evaded him. His thoughts returned, unbidden, unwelcome, to the memory of a younger Aurelia, earnest and soft-spoken, always standing a step behind the louder young ladies of the season. He remembered her quiet hopefulness, the kind that shone through even when she tried desperately to conceal it. He remembered the way she used to glance at him when she thought he wasn't looking, eyes filled with something painfully pure. And he remembered the night he broke that innocence without ever meaning to. It had been a spring ball, 3 seasons ago, though it felt distant enough to belong to a previous life. Aurelia had gathered the courage to approach him, her hands trembling slightly in her gloves. She had attempted conversation. She had offered sincerity. She had given him a piece of her heart in the only way a young woman of gentle nature could, without fanfare, without expectations, with quiet hope. He had dismissed her, not cruelly, not intentionally, but with the cold efficiency of a man who had been taught to fear tenderness more than hostility. He had given her a polite smile, a distant bow, and words that were meant to be formal, yet harmless. But to a heart like hers, those words had been enough to shatter something delicate. He closed his eyes, remembering the expression she wore after he excused himself. Not wounded enough to cause a scene. Aurelia had more dignity than that. But he had seen the flicker of hurt before she lowered her gaze. He had ignored it then, walking away with the self-assurance of a man who believed he had protected both of them by maintaining distance. He had not considered that distance could wound as deeply as cruelty. A soft knock sounded at his chamber door the next morning. The Duke sat up, running a hand through his hair. "Enter!" The valet stepped inside, bowing lightly. "Good morning, Your Grace. Your breakfast will be served in the blue drawing room. A letter has also arrived for you. Leave it on the desk." But the valet hesitated, a rare occurrence. "Your Grace, it is from Aramor." The Duke's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Aramor. The name alone carried the weight of memory he avoided. "Very well," he said quietly. "Leave it." Once the valet departed, the Duke crossed the room and picked up the envelope. The handwriting was unmistakable, sharp, precise, unmistakably military. It was from his older brother, Lord Cedric Hawthorne. He turned the envelope over in his hand and pressed his thumb into its seal, but did not open it. Aramor was where Cedric had chosen exile after the war, where he buried his grief, his rage, his guilt. The Duke had spent years trying to distance himself from those same emotions, yet here they were, resurfacing like ghosts awakened by Aurelia's quiet gaze the night before. He sank into the leather chair by the hearth and finally broke the seal. The letter was short, but not cold. "Ravensfield, rumor travels faster than intention. I have heard Lady Aurelia has returned to London. I trust you will treat her with the kindness our family failed to show her in years past. Do not allow your pride to drive her away again. Cedric. The Duke read the letter twice. He felt the familiar ache settle beneath his ribs, a subtle, constant reminder of the rift between the brothers who once had everything and lost more than the world ever knew. Cedric had always understood what the Duke could not admit, that the Duke's restraint was often nothing more than fear. Fear of vulnerability, fear of tenderness, fear of the past repeating itself. He folded the letter and slipped it into the desk drawer, pushing it out of sight. But the words lingered. Do not allow your pride to drive her away again. He rose, adjusted his coat, and left the chamber. Later that afternoon, the Duke attended a modest gathering at Lady Weatherly's townhouse. He had intended to decline the invitation, but whispers of Aurelia's attendance had reached him, and he could not explain, even to himself, why that mattered. The townhouse was filled with soft music, polished laughter, and the faint scent of lavender. He walked through the corridors with practiced composure, greeting those who approached him, though his attention remained elsewhere. He searched for her without allowing his eyes to appear as though they were searching. He found her in a sunlit alcove near the French doors. She stood alone, reading a slim volume of poetry, the pages held delicately between her fingers. Her profile was serene, the light casting a golden warmth across her cheek. He paused a distance away, concealed by a marble column, observing her with a mixture of restraint and an uninvited tenderness that unsettled him. Aurelia had always sought sanctuary in books. She once confessed, though only once, that stories helped her understand the world she struggled to navigate. He had never forgotten that confession, though he pretended he had. He moved toward her before he could reconsider. Lady Aurelia. She looked up, startled yet composed. Your Grace, I had not expected to find you in attendance today, he said, though the lie tasted faintly of guilt. Her lips curved in a polite, neutral smile. London is smaller than we remember, is it not? One cannot avoid familiar faces for long. He nodded. No, one cannot. She closed the book and held it lightly to her chest. There was a quiet reserve in her posture, the demeanor of someone who had rebuilt herself carefully and now guarded that reconstruction with dignity. The Duke felt the old wound stir again, the memory of hurting her, not with malice, but with negligence. He forced himself to speak, though the words came with difficulty. Lady Aurelia, about last night. She turned her gaze toward the garden beyond the French doors. There is no need to address it, Your Grace. The past is merely that, the past. The Duke swallowed. Her calmness unsettled him more than any confrontation would have. He had prepared himself for reproach, perhaps for coldness, but not for a serenity that excluded him so completely. You have changed, he said quietly. She looked at him, her eyes clear, steady. Time changes everyone. It has changed you for the better. A shadow of a smile touched her lips. Perhaps, or perhaps I simply learned what I should have known then, that one cannot seek validation from those unwilling to offer it. Her words cut through him far more deeply than she intended. He felt his jaw tense, though he kept his expression carefully composed. I never intended... Your Grace, she interrupted gently. Intention does not always lessen the wound. There was no bitterness in her tone, no accusation. That made it worse. He looked down at the book in her hands, grasping for something, anything, to anchor the conversation. What are you reading? Byron. He nodded. I remember you preferred him to Wordsworth. Her brow lifted in faint surprise. You remember that? I remember more than you think. The silence that followed carried a tension neither of them wished to acknowledge. Footsteps approached. Lord Hawthorne, Cedric's old friend and Aurelia's distant cousin, stepped into the alcove with a bright smile. Aurelia, there you are. Might I tempt you with a stroll through the garden? The camellias are in bloom, and I believe they would be much improved by your company. Aurelia laughed softly, and the sound tugged at something deep in the Duke's chest. She nodded and allowed Hawthorne to offer his arm. Before following him out, she turned back to the Duke with politeness, nothing more. Good afternoon, Your Grace. And she left, again. As he watched her step into the garden beside another man, the Duke felt something sharp coil in his chest, something he had not felt in years, perhaps not since he himself had been young enough to believe in the purity of affection. Jealousy, but not the hot, reckless jealousy of youth, a quieter, deeper kind, a slow-burning ache of realization. Realization that she had once looked at him the way she now looked at the garden, thoughtfully, hopefully, openly. Realization that he had taken that tenderness and responded with indifference. Realization that she had grown beyond him, while he remained frozen in the fortress he mistook for strength. He exhaled slowly, the breath barely noticeable, yet heavy enough to shift something inside him. For the first time since last night, he admitted, to himself alone in the privacy of his own thoughts, that her return unsettled him, because she represented everything he had denied himself. Warmth, gentleness, hope, all the things he once regarded as vulnerability, but which time had taught him might have been salvation. He stood motionless as guests continued to chatter around him, as the soft music filled the air, as the world moved forward. But he remained trapped in the quiet echo of her words. Intention does not always lessen the wound. He left the gathering early, ignoring those who attempted conversation. The air outside was brisk, biting. The sky carried the heavy weight of snow about to fall. As the Duke stepped into his carriage, he felt the old wound open fully. Not the wound she once carried, but the one he had always refused to acknowledge in himself. The wound of pride, the wound of regret, the wound of a man who finally, painfully understood what he had thrown away. And though he sat rigidly in the carriage, hands clasped tightly, jaw tense, heart steadying itself against a truth long denied, he knew the past had returned. He knew he could no longer outrun it. And he knew, perhaps for the first time, that Lady Aurelia's presence awakened a fear he had spent years burying, the fear of wanting something he no longer deserved. The following week unfolded with an elegance that mocked the Duke of Ravensfield's growing turmoil. London glittered under the pale winter sun, and yet every salon, every ball, every small gathering seemed to conspire against his composure. Wherever he turned, Lady Aurelia's presence appeared in some corner of the room, never close enough to force conversation, never distant enough to be forgotten. And always, always she was not alone. It was not that she sought attention, she never had. It was simply that people gravitated toward her now, drawn to the serenity she carried like a quiet lantern. Men found themselves offering her a seat, a drink, conversation, as though it were instinctive. Women, some warmly, others with envy, watched her with that peculiar attentiveness they reserved for women who blossomed beyond expectation. But what unsettled the Duke most was not the change in society's gaze. It was the change in hers. She did not look for him. She did not linger on him. She did not wait for him to acknowledge her. Where once her eyes had betrayed admiration, hope, and a timid affection no one else dared name, now she possessed a calmness that excluded him entirely. She moved through rooms without appearing conscious of his presence. No worse than that. She moved as though she had already come to terms with it, and he had no idea how to bear that. 3 days after Lady Weatherly's gathering, the Duke found himself invited to Lord Penbury's winter soiree, an event he would normally attend without feeling anything at all. But that evening, he stood at the top of Penbury's staircase, gripping the wooden railing a fraction too tightly. Below, the ballroom glowed with candlelight reflected off polished silver. Musicians tuned their instruments. Servants carried trays of champagne. Guests in jewel-toned gowns clustered near the hearth, laughing as though the night belonged solely to their frivolous tongues. And then he saw her. Lady Aurelia stood near the center of the room beside Mr. Thomas Alden, an earnest man of respectable lineage, 10 years her senior, known for his unshakable politeness and quiet charm. Perfectly harmless man, a perfectly acceptable suitor, a perfectly irritating presence. The Duke's jaw tightened. Alden bent slightly as Aurelia whispered something to him, and she laughed, softly, the kind of laugh a man remembers for years without meaning to. The sound reached the Duke's chest like a physical ache. He descended the staircase with calm, measured steps, ignoring the greetings offered by those eager to claim his attention. He nodded in passing, his mind fixed elsewhere. His heart beat in the slow, heavy rhythm of a man walking towards something he could no longer ignore. But when he reached the ballroom floor, he did not approach her. His pride would not allow it. pride that had protected him for decades, pride that whispered he had no right to interfere, pride that kept him anchored to formality, even as jealousy clawed silently beneath his ribs. Instead, he positioned himself near the refreshments table where he could observe without appearing to observe. Aurelia's gown was a pale blue that evening, delicate yet dignified, a shade that reminded him painfully of the spring ball where he first wounded her. Her hair was arranged with simplicity again, a few soft curls brushing her neck. She wore no extravagant jewels, only a thin silver chain, the same one she wore 3 years ago, a small foolish detail. But he noticed it, and it unsettled him more than anything else. Alden offered her a glass of champagne. She accepted it. Their fingers brushed, briefly, politely. The Duke felt something cold settle beneath his sternum. They spoke quietly, leaning toward one another in a way that suggested a comfortable rapport. Not flirtation. Aurelia was too reserved, too cautious for careless flirtation. But there was a warmth there, a mutual ease, a familiarity that had taken root in mere days. The Duke realized with slow, dreadful certainty that Alden was not merely another man in the room. He was a contender, a rival. The Duke of Ravensfield did not believe in rivalry, not in affairs of the heart, never in anything that required vulnerability. Yet tonight, he felt it, a quiet battle unfolding, unspoken, unwelcome. He picked up a champagne glass from a passing tray. His hand remained steady, though only by years of discipline. Across the room, Aurelia glanced to the side, and for the briefest moment, her eyes met his. A pause, a breath, a flicker of something unreadable. Then she looked back at Alden. It should have relieved him. It should have reinforced the distance he intended, the emotional boundary he needed. Instead, it settled into him like a bruise. The first waltz of the evening began with the soft swell of violins. Couples moved toward the center of the floor. Alden turned to Aurelia, asking for the dance with a polite incline of his head. For years, she would have hesitated, glanced at the Duke, sought his unspoken approval, even though he never offered it. But tonight she accepted without hesitation. The Duke closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again, unwilling to look away. Alden placed a hand at her waist, the touch respectful yet intimate in a way that awakened something deep, raw, and long suppressed in the Duke's chest. They began to move with the music, graceful, synchronized, unaware of the man who watched them with a quiet torment he could not voice. Aurelia's steps were fluid. She followed the rhythm effortlessly, her gown swirling with each turn. Alden smiled at something she said, and she smiled back. The Duke could not bear it. He turned abruptly and walked toward the far edge of the room, seeking refuge near the tall windows overlooking the snowy courtyard. The cold pressed faintly through the glass, grounding him, but not enough to calm the tightening in his spine. He lifted the champagne to his lips but could not bring himself to drink. "Your Grace," came a soft voice behind him. He turned slowly. Lady Beatrice Ashford, a family friend, elegant and perceptive, stood with a curious expression. "You seem uncharacteristically troubled tonight." "Do I?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. "Indeed. Your gaze has not strayed far from Lady Aurelia all evening." His heart clenched. He forced his expression into carefully constructed indifference. "You are mistaken." "Am I?" Beatrice tilted her head. "She dances beautifully." He did not reply. Beatrice followed his gaze toward the couple on the ballroom floor. "Mr. Alden appears rather taken with her." Again, silence. "And she, with him." This time the Duke looked away. Beatrice drew a soft breath. "Forgive my boldness, Your Grace, but if you carry feelings for her—" "I do not." The words left too quickly, too sharply. Beatrice raised a brow. "Then allow me to rephrase. If you carry any regard for her of any kind, you must know she has changed. She is no longer the girl who waited for your approval." The Duke said nothing. "And if you do not act," Beatrice continued gently, "another man will." She left him with that, her words dissolving into the hum of conversation around them. He remained by the window long after the waltz ended. When he finally turned, he saw Aurelia and Alden leaving the dance floor together. She touched her temple, laughing lightly at something he said. A lock of hair had come loose from its pin and brushed her cheek. Alden reached as though to gently correct it, but she tucked the strand away herself, smiling. The Duke felt something inside him twist. Not anger, not resentment, but a deep, quiet ache he could no longer deny. Jealousy, not the dramatic kind that consumed lesser men, but the suffocating, restrained jealousy of a man who had spent years mastering silence, only to discover that silence had cost him more than he ever intended to lose. He realized then that he could no longer pretend indifference. He could no longer hide behind formality. He could no longer rely on pride to protect him, because pride had already taken enough. He stepped away from the window, intent on approaching her, on speaking to her, on reclaiming at least some small portion of the past that slipped further from his grasp with each passing hour. But as he moved through the room, Lord Everett Penbury intercepted him. "Your Grace, a moment, if you please. There is a matter regarding the estate boundary near Ravensfield we must discuss." The Duke clenched his jaw. "This is not the time." "Nonsense. It will take but a minute." The minute became 5. 5 became 10. 10 became 20. By the time he extricated himself from the conversation, Aurelia was no longer in sight. He searched discreetly, once across the ballroom, twice, a third time, with growing tension. At last, near the open doors leading to the conservatory, he saw her stepping out into the moonlit garden, alone. An opportunity, an invitation perhaps, or merely fate granting him a sliver of her presence without Alden clouding it. He crossed the ballroom with long, determined strides, ignoring greetings, ignoring propriety, ignoring everything except the slender silhouette moving beyond the glass doors. He reached the conservatory threshold and found Alden already there. Alden stepped into the garden after her, closing the door halfway behind him, leaving just enough space for the Duke to see them but not enough to intrude without drawing attention. Alden offered Aurelia his coat against the cold. She accepted it with a grateful smile. Snow fell softly around them, settling in her hair, glowing under the moonlight. They stood beneath the bare branches of a winter tree, speaking quietly, intimately, as though the world had faded around them. And for the first time in years, the Duke felt something break inside him. Not loudly, not visibly, but with the quiet devastation of ice cracking beneath the weight of its own silence. He understood, in that moment, what pride had truly cost him, and the jealousy that engulfed him was not the jealousy of rivalry. It was the jealousy of regret. The jealousy of a man realizing, too late, that the woman he once ignored was the only woman who had ever seen him. He stepped back from the conservatory doors, breath steady, expression unchanged, posture regal, every inch the Duke. But inside, the storm had begun. A storm he could not ignore. A storm he could no longer outrun. A storm that would force him, sooner rather than later, to confront the truth he had buried for far too long. He was afraid of losing the one thing he never had the courage to seek. For days after Lord Penbury's soiree, the Duke of Ravensfield carried a heaviness he had no name for, a weight that settled beneath his ribs with the slow, suffocating pressure of something long restrained, now pressing against its confines. He concealed it well, of course. No one in London detected the subtle shift in his composure. His posture remained impeccable, his expression unreadable, his words measured. But beneath the surface, everything had begun to fracture. He told himself that jealousy was unbecoming, unworthy of a man of his stature. And yet jealousy clung to him with a persistence he could not shake. It haunted him in the silence of his study, in the pause between letters he refused to answer, in the reflection that stared back at him from the darkened window each night. Most of all, it haunted him in the memory of Aurelia's smile as she stood beneath falling snow, wearing Mr. Alden's coat. That image returned to him with cruel clarity. Aurelia, gentle, serene once, timid, now standing confident, warm, beautiful, and undeniably beyond his reach. He had not attempted to speak with her since the soiree. Pride held him back, pride whispering that he had already surrendered more of himself than he wished to admit. Pride insisted that approaching her now would expose what he had buried for years, but something deeper, fear, kept him distant. Fear that she would not welcome his presence, fear that he had waited too long, fear that she had finally, irrevocably moved. on yet. He could not simply disappear from society without arousing suspicion, so he attended the next major engagement of the season, Lady Cullenworth's Winter Garden Ball, a night he would come to regret. The gardens of Cullenworth House had been transformed into a winter spectacle. Thousands of lanterns hung from the branches like stolen stars, their warm glow reflecting off frost-covered roses and winding stone paths. A quartet played near the frozen fountain, their music drifting like a soft breeze through the crowd. The Duke arrived fashionably late, as he always did, his presence rippling through the gathered guests like a subtle shift in the wind. Conversations quieted, eyes followed him, and yet none of it mattered to him tonight. His gaze sought only one face. He found her near the illuminated rose archway. Lady Aurelia stood speaking with Lady Seraphine, her posture relaxed, her hands clasped gently in front of her. Her gown was a deep midnight blue that contrasted beautifully with her pale complexion. The sight of her stole the breath he did not realize he held, but beside her stood someone else, Alden. The Duke's jaw tightened. He approached, polite and controlled, offering Lady Seraphine a brief bow. Aurelia turned to him with surprise flickering in her eyes, though she hid it quickly. "Your Grace," she said, the tone polite, distant. "A pleasant evening, Lady Aurelia," he replied, matching her formality. Alden regarded him with a cordial nod. "You have chosen a fine night to grace us, Your Grace." The Duke inclined his head. For a moment the four of them stood under the soft lantern glow, the air heavy with unspoken tensions. Lady Seraphine excused herself, sensing the subtle current beneath the surface. That left the three of them, exactly the situation the Duke had hoped to avoid, yet somehow could not walk away from. "Lady Aurelia," Alden said gently, "would you care for refreshment? I can return shortly." "Of course," she replied, smiling. Lightly, Alden walked away, and the Duke made the mistake. He spoke without thought, without caution. "You seem very comfortable in Mr. Alden's company." Aurelia blinked, studying him with calm confusion. "Should I not be comfortable in the company of a friend?" He hesitated, but pride pushed the words forward. "A friend? Is that what he is?" Her gaze sharpened almost imperceptibly. "Yes. And what else would he be?" The Duke felt the sting of that question but refused to show it. "It appears, Lady Aurelia, that Mr. Alden has developed a certain interest." Aurelia straightened, her expression cooling. "If that is true, Your Grace, it is something he and I may discuss privately when the time is right." "Privately," the Duke repeated, the words striking him like a blow. "Yes." Her voice remained soft, but there was a firmness beneath it, steel wrapped in silk. "My personal affairs are not a matter for public or unsolicited commentary." He felt the rebuke, sharp, precise, delivered with dignity. Still he pressed on, too far, too hard. "You would do well to consider that not every man who expresses an interest has honorable intentions." Her eyes widened, hurt flickering across her face before she mastered it. "Mr. Alden is nothing but honorable. You cannot know that. And you do." The question hit him with startling force. Aurelia stepped back half a pace, her breath forming a soft mist in the cold night air. "Your Grace, what are you implying?" He should have stopped. Rationality begged him to stop, but jealousy spoke louder. "I am implying," he said quietly, "that you may be too trusting." Aurelia stared at him, disbelief overtaking hurt. "I see." "Aurelia," he began. She shook her head slightly, cutting him off. "I never imagined you would speak to me with such condescension again." He flinched, though only internally. "You misunderstand my intention." "I understand it perfectly," she replied, her tone polite, yet trembling with restrained emotion. "You believe that I am incapable of making sound judgment. You believe that I require guidance or worse, supervision. You believe that I remain the girl I once was, timid, uncertain, waiting for your approval." Her breath shook faintly. "And you are wrong." The Duke felt his chest tighten, the cold air turning sharp as glass. "Aurelia," he said, voice low, "I meant only—" "You meant," she interrupted softly, "to remind me that you still hold power over me." His breath caught. "And that is precisely why I must remove myself from your company." She curtsied, formal, graceful, final, and stepped away before he could speak. He reached out instinctively, his hand stopping inches from her arm. He could not touch her. He had no right. Aurelia walked back into the lantern-lit crowd, disappearing among swirling gowns and polished boots. The Duke remained frozen beneath the rose archway, the winter air burning against his throat. The music swelled, the ball continued, and yet he felt utterly still, anchored to the spot where she had walked away from him for the second time in as many days. This time it was not gentle, it was not composed, it was not softened by politeness. It was a clean break. He closed his eyes, the ache inside him deepening with every breath. Pride whispered that he had spoken to protect her. Fear whispered that he had spoken to protect himself. But truth, cold, merciless truth, revealed itself in the silence. He had spoken like a man terrified of losing her, terrified of admitting he cared, terrified of relinquishing the walls he had built, terrified of feeling something he could not control. He left the archway with controlled steps, walking deeper into the garden to escape the constriction in his chest. Lanterns flickered above him, illuminating the frost-covered ground. His breath came slow and unsteady. For the first time in years, he felt the edges of panic begin to form. Not the frantic panic of fear, but the quiet, devastating panic of regret. He reached the frozen fountain and gripped its marble edge. He had hurt her. Again. Not with silence this time, but with words shaped by pride and jealousy masquerading as concern. A gust of cold air swept through the garden, carrying faint echoes of laughter and music from the ballroom. The Duke stared at the ice forming beneath the fountain's sculpture, watching the moonlight reflect across its surface. He had no idea how long he stood there. At some point he heard footsteps. He did not turn. "Your Grace," Alden's voice said behind him. The Duke's shoulders stiffened. Alden approached, stopping a respectful distance away. His tone remained polite, but there was unmistakable firmness beneath it. "I believe Lady Aurelia is distressed." The Duke said nothing. Alden continued, "I do not know the nature of your history with her. It is not my place to inquire, but I would hope for her sake that old wounds are not being reopened." A flicker of pain crossed the Duke's face, barely visible. Alden waited. When the Duke finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled, edged with something raw. "I do not wish to hurt her." "And yet," Alden replied softly, "you have." Silence. "If you care for her," Alden said gently, "then consider what she needs, not what you fear." The Duke's breath halted. Because the truth was unbearable, what she needed was kindness, stability, warmth, things Alden could offer far more easily than a man who had imprisoned his own heart for years. Alden inclined his head respectfully and walked away, leaving the Duke alone in the cold garden. Minutes passed, or hours. He could not tell. Eventually he straightened, each breath tighter than the last. He knew what Aurelia saw in Alden: gentleness, security, a man unafraid of tenderness. The kind of man the Duke himself had never allowed himself to be. And beneath that realization, a deeper fear emerged. He might already have lost her. He left the garden without saying goodbye to anyone. He entered his carriage, instructed the driver to return to Ravensfield House, and sat in rigid silence as the snow began to fall. As the wheels turned against the cobblestone streets, the Duke pressed his gloved fingers against his forehead, eyes closing in a rare moment of vulnerability. Tonight, he had committed the one act he swore he never would. He had wounded her again, not by accident, not through indifference, but through fear, wearing the mask of authority. For the first time, the Duke allowed himself to acknowledge the truth that had been forming ever since Aurelia returned. He was afraid, deeply, profoundly afraid. Afraid of wanting her, afraid of losing her, afraid of deserving neither outcome. When the carriage finally stopped at Ravensfield House, he did not enter the residence immediately. He remained seated in the dark interior, his breath unsteady, his pride slowly unraveling under the weight of realization. He had lost control of the night, of his emotions, of himself. And as the snow fell softly outside, the Duke of Ravensfield bowed his head, not in defeat but in the quiet, devastating acknowledgement that something within him had broken, something he could no longer repair alone, something he could no longer ignore. He had pushed her away, and for the first time in his life, and he feared the consequences. The days that followed Lady Cullenworth's winter garden ball became a private winter of their own inside the Duke of Ravensfield, a silent, consuming season that settled into his chest like a storm without thunder. No announcement was made. No dramatic incident echoed through London's gossip circles. No scandalous whispers spread across drawing rooms. The world moved forward, as it always did, but the Duke felt suspended in a place between regret and paralysis. Aurelia did not send word. She did not call. She did not seek him in any of the public gatherings that ordinarily would have forced them into the same room. But the Duke did not seek her either. Pride held him still. Pride and fear. Yet beneath both, regret pressed like frost against a window pane, slowly and silently, sealing him off from everything warm. 4 mornings after the ball, Ravensfield stood in his study, staring at a half-written letter on his mahogany desk. He had attempted for hours to form a coherent apology, but there were no words refined enough, noble enough, or honest enough to convey what he needed to say without revealing more than he knew how to express. Lady Aurelia, I find myself compelled to address my behavior at Cullenworth's ball. He had written that line a dozen times, each one more hollow than the last. He dipped his quill into the ink again, hands steady, but heart unmoored. Outside, the London sky was a pale grey, the kind that pressed low upon the city with the promise of snow. The fireplace crackled quietly, offering warmth he could not feel. I spoke with impropriety. I allowed my concern to be overshadowed by emotion. I behaved. He paused. The word he sought jealously refused to be written. A duke does not confess jealousy, not on paper, not aloud, not even to himself. He closed the letter, folded it, and stared at the blank seal. After a long moment he tore the page in half, then into quarters, then into shreds small enough that even memory could not piece them together again. He let the fragments fall into the fireplace. Flames consumed the apology that would never reach her. That evening, Ravensfield attended a gathering at the Whitmore residence, not because he wished to socialize, but because remaining home had become unbearable. Silence pressed against him more fiercely than the judgments of any room filled with aristocrats. He arrived early, uncharacteristically so, hoping to maintain some semblance of normalcy. But the moment he stepped into the candlelit ballroom, the truth struck him with devastating clarity. She was not there. He had not asked. He had not sought information. But he felt her absence instantly, as though the room lacked a vital element of air. He greeted Lord Whitmore, made polite comments about the decor, and sipped wine he did not taste. Conversations seemed dull, meaningless. Laughter grated. Music sounded distant and thin, unable to penetrate the heavy walls of his thoughts. He moved toward a group of gentlemen, discussing the political climate in Parliament, but their voices blurred. He excused himself quickly, making his way to the adjacent gallery, where portraits from past generations stared down with solemn, judging eyes. He stood before a large painting of the first Duke of Ravensfield, his namesake, a man known for fierce pride and calculated distance. The resemblance between them was undeniable. And yet, staring at the portrait, Ravensfield felt something entirely new, a clarity that chilled him. "This is what I have become," he murmured under his breath. "Untouchable, unyielding, alone." He turned and left the gallery, leaving the ghosts of his lineage behind him. 2 nights passed before he saw Aurelia again. It was at a modest dinner hosted by the Warburtons, an event he attended by force of habit rather than desire. The dining room glowed with the soft light of candelabras, the crystal glasses shimmered, and the scent of roasted pheasant curled through the air. As he entered, his heart stilled. Aurelia sat at the far end of the table. She did not look up immediately. When she finally did, her gaze brushed past him, polite but distant, as though acknowledging a stranger. She inclined her head, nothing more, and returned her attention to Lady Warburton beside her. He felt the weight of that gesture like a stone sinking into his chest. He took his seat across the room. Throughout the dinner, he found himself unable to focus on the conversation around him. He heard laughter, discussions of upcoming holidays, remarks about the frost outside, but all of it faded beneath the quiet, suffocating awareness that she was merely 10 seats away, yet impossibly distant. She laughed once, softly, lightly, at something Lord Hawthorne said. It struck him harder than any deliberate wound could have. How easily she laughed now, how warmly she seemed to converse with others, how skillfully she created distance where there once had been closeness, however fragile. He picked up his glass and set it down again. "Is everything quite well, Your Grace?" asked Lady Whitmore from 2 seats away. He offered a faint smile. "Perfectly." But the lie settled heavily on his tongue. After dinner, guests moved into the drawing room for tea and conversation. Aurelia stood speaking with Lady Penbury and her daughter, her posture composed, her expression serene. The Duke's chest tightened. He had to speak with her, even if only to attempt to repair the damage he caused, even if only to stand close enough to understand whether he had truly lost her. He crossed the room, careful, deliberate. Each step felt heavier than the last. "Lady Aurelia," he said quietly. She turned. Her face betrayed nothing. No warmth, no hostility, nothing but impeccable politeness. "Your Grace," he swallowed. "May I speak with you, if you have a moment?" Her eyes flickered, but she nodded once. "Of course." She followed him to the edge of the room, near the marble fireplace where a soft fire crackled. Guests mingled nearby, but not close enough to overhear. The Duke faced her, wrestling with words. "I wish to apologize for my behavior at Cullenworth's ball. I spoke out of turn." "You did," she agreed, not unkindly. He felt the sting. "I acted with misplaced concern." Aurelia waited. He continued. "And perhaps also emotion." It cost him something to admit even that. Aurelia's eyes softened briefly enough that he might have imagined it. "I appreciate your effort to address it, Your Grace." The formality of her tone struck him harder than her rebuke at the gardens. "Aurelia." He caught himself too late, but she did not correct him. He lowered his voice. "I never wished to wound you." A gentle breath escaped her. "And yet you did." He closed his eyes for a moment. "Yes." Silence stretched between them, long, fragile, filled with everything he wished he had said years ago. When Aurelia finally spoke, her tone was quiet, steady. "Your words at the ball. They reminded me of how I once allowed myself to feel small in your presence, how I waited for your approval, how I believed myself unworthy when you withheld it." His breath caught. "That was not my intention. But it was the effect," she replied softly. A sharp ache pierced him. He looked down at his gloved hands. "I was wrong. People change, Your Grace," she said, her tone lacking bitterness. "I have changed. I will not return to the person I once was." He raised his gaze to hers. "I do not want you to." Aurelia's eyes softened again, finally, unmistakably, but she blinked quickly, regaining composure. "I hope that whatever lies between us may find peace." He felt the words slipping from him. "Is peace all you wish?" Aurelia hesitated, just enough to tear something inside him. "Yes," she said finally. He bowed his head slightly. "Then I will not trouble you." "Thank you," she whispered. She stepped back, offered a small curtsy, and walked away to rejoin the other guests. The Duke watched her go, his heart constricting with painful clarity. Peace was all she asked. Peace was all she believed she should seek, and he, once the source of her turmoil, could offer her nothing else. That night, he returned to Ravensfield House alone. Snow had fallen heavily, blanketing the city in a pale, quiet sorrow. He dismissed the servants and walked directly to his study. A letter lay on his desk, the one from Cedric, unopened since their last exchange. He finally broke the seal. "Ravensfield, distance is not always abandonment. Sometimes it is protection, both for oneself and for others. Do not hide behind pride. It destroys far more than it preserves. Cedric." The Duke lowered the letter slowly. Cedric had always known. He closed his eyes, the weight of the room pressing against him. He was losing her, not dramatically, not publicly, but quietly, irrevocably. And this time, it was entirely his fault. He walked to the window and looked out at the snow-covered gardens of Ravensfield House. In the stillness of the night he whispered, barely audible even to himself, "I fear I may have damaged more than her trust." The whisper lingered in the cold air. "I fear I have damaged my chance at ever being worthy of her. Snow continued to fall, soft and relentless, and for the first time in his life, the Duke understood what it meant not to be alone by choice, but by consequence. He stood there until the first light of morning crept through the sky, breathing in silence, swallowing remorse, and knowing that the distance between them had become something real, something formidable, something he could no longer ignore. And with the dawn came a decision, a quiet, determined, heartbreaking decision. He would not allow the story to end this way. But for now, for this moment, the separation stood between them like winter itself, cold, unyielding, and devastating. The day after the Warburton dinner was the Duke's first morning in months spent entirely outside the confines of his own pride. Something in him had shifted, not abruptly, but with the slow, breaking weight of realization settling into bone. For the first time, he understood that regret was no longer a fleeting shadow behind him, but a companion sitting heavily at his side. He stood by the tall windows of his study, watching the pale London sky brighten by fragments as the winter sun fought its way through the clouds. Snow clung to the branches in Ravensfield's gardens, softening their rigid shapes, muting the world into silence. His valet entered quietly. "Will you be taking breakfast in the dining room, Your Grace?" "No," he said, fastening the buttons of his coat. "I will take it elsewhere." "And where shall I inform the staff?" "Nowhere," he cut gently. "I will not be home for several hours." The valet bowed. "As you wish, Your Grace." For once, his decisions were not guided by propriety or routine. He did not intend to send messages or arrange meetings through circuits of etiquette. He needed to see her, not to demand forgiveness, not to assert control, but to try, in the only way he now knew how, to make amends. He left Ravensfield House without ceremony, without escort, without the usual preparation that accompanied a duke's presence in public. He arrived at the Hawthorne townhouse as the last of the morning frost melted on the railings. His heart tightened. Would she even be willing to see him? He knocked. A servant answered. "Good morning, Your Grace." "Good morning, His voice faltered slightly. "Is Lady Aurelia receiving visitors?" The servant hesitated. "My lady has stepped out for a walk. She left not long ago. Do you know where?" "She often visits St. Albans." "Garden at this hour?" He nodded curtly. "Thank you." St. Albans Garden was quiet in winter, visited mostly by older women taking slow walks and young mothers pushing prams through the frost-dusted paths. The Duke walked along the gravel walkway with unusual uncertainty. Ravensfield knew how to command armies of servants, estates, and business affairs, but today he could not even command his breath to steady. Then he saw her. Aurelia stood near the iron fence at the far end of the garden, her gloved hand resting lightly on the cold metal. She gazed at the frozen pond, her expression soft but distant, as though her thoughts drifted somewhere far beyond the garden's borders. The sight of her, quiet, solitary, unaware of him, filled the Duke's chest with something painfully tender. He approached slowly. "Lady Aurelia." She turned. Her eyes widened for the smallest fraction of a second. Surprise, maybe even confusion, before returning to that composed reserve he had come to expect since their break. "Your Grace." The winter breeze lifted a strand of her hair, brushing it across her cheek. She tucked it behind her ear with calm grace. "I did not expect to see you here. I wished to speak with you." A pause. "Here?" she asked, glancing around at the barren trees. "Here," he confirmed. She hesitated. "I am not sure there is anything left for us to say." "There is," he replied, his tone firm but not forceful. "And if you permit only a moment, I will keep it brief." Aurelia looked down at her gloves, then back at him. "Very well." He inhaled gently. The cold air stung his lungs. "I behaved poorly at Cullenworth's ball. I allowed emotions I did not understand to dictate my words." Her brows lifted slightly. "And what emotions were those?" He froze. He could not give her the truth, not fully. Jealousy, longing, fear. They were words that felt too fragile, too revealing for a man raised to bury every feeling beneath steel. "I was concerned," he said, though the word felt inadequate. "And mistaken." "Mistaken?" "Yes." She held his gaze quietly, waiting. He continued. Mr. Alden is a man of good character. I had no right, none at all, to speak as I did. Aurelia seemed surprised by the admission, but she did not soften. Your apology is noted, Your Grace. He swallowed. Her tone was respectful, but lifeless, formal to the point of ache. Aurelia, he said, unable to stop himself, I do not wish for there to be distance between us. She exhaled, a gentle cloud of breath dissolving into the air. Distance is sometimes necessary. For you, he murmured, or for me. She hesitated, and that hesitation sliced through him. For both of us, she said finally. He felt something subtle break. Aurelia, I wish to repair what I have damaged. You cannot. Her answer was immediate, steady, final. It struck harder than any blow he had endured in war or parliament. She continued, voice quiet, but unwavering. Some wounds heal with time, others heal with distance. The ones you inflicted require both. He felt the cold draw deeper into his chest. Then let me at least know, she interrupted softly. Please. He closed his eyes briefly, steadying himself. When he opened them again, she was looking away, toward the pond, the trees, anywhere but him. He nodded. Very well. He took a step back, not dramatically, not with defeat, but with a quiet acceptance that left frost settling in his throat. She turned toward the path, ready to leave. He almost let her go. Almost. Aurelia, he called softly. She stopped. He allowed himself just once to speak with sincerity stripped of pride. I know I am not a man who expresses what others hope to hear. I know I hold myself too tightly. But if you ever believe me indifferent to your well-being, you are mistaken. She did not turn, but her fingers tightened slightly around the fabric of her gloves. After a long, breathless pause, she replied, Good day, Your Grace. And she walked away. Her steps were controlled, steady, dignified, but each footfall felt like a door closing inside him. The Duke of Ravensfield did not follow. He watched her disappear into the white shimmer of the garden path, feeling every ounce of the distance she had placed between them. The following days became a cruel pattern. Wherever she was, he seemed to arrive a moment too late, or she left a moment too soon. He never sought to corner her, never expressed jealousy again, never repeated the mistake of presuming the right to guide her decisions. Instead, he watched from afar, restrained, respectful, painfully changed. When she entered a room, he looked away before their eyes could meet, out of politeness, not indifference. When she laughed with friends, he did not interfere, though her laughter carved aching hollows inside him. When she danced, he stood at the edge of the ballroom, never once taking a step forward unless she wished it. He proved change by restraint. He proved regard by silence. He proved remorse by distance. And slowly, very slowly, Aurelia's expression toward him shifted. Not warmth, not affection, but curiosity. A thin crack in the wall she had built. It was not enough, but it was something. One evening during a reading hosted by Lady Ashbourne, fate placed Aurelia and the Duke on opposite sides of a narrow salon filled with whispers of poetry and the scent of burning cedar. She glanced at him only once, and he, very gently, without expectation, inclined his head in acknowledgement. For the first time since their separation, she did not look away instantly. Her gaze lingered for a heartbeat. Her lips parted slightly, almost imperceptibly. The Duke felt a warmth he had not known in months. It was not forgiveness, it was not closeness, but it was a beginning, until the door opened, and everything changed. A footman entered the salon, bowing. Lady Aurelia Hawthorne. Aurelia rose, concern flickering across her features. Yes, a letter for you, my lady, delivered with urgency. She accepted it, brows knitting tightly as she unfolded the paper. Her eyes moved quickly across the lines. Her breath caught. The Duke's chest constricted instantly. Is everything all right? He asked quietly, stepping closer without thought. Aurelia seemed unable to speak. Her hand trembled around the letter. Lady Aurelia, he said again, his voice low, steady with restrained alarm. She lifted her gaze to him, and what he saw in her eyes forced the air from his lungs. Fear, real fear. Not fear of him, not fear of uncertainty, but fear of something far, far worse. "My mother," she whispered. "She has fallen gravely ill. Her voice broke. "I must leave London at once." The room seemed to tilt imperceptibly. "Do you require assistance?" the Duke asked, already reaching for his gloves. "A carriage, an escort, anything you need?" "No," she said quickly, stepping back. "I cannot ask anything of you." "You need not ask," he replied, struggling to keep emotion from his tone. Aurelia shook her head. "I must go alone." "Aurelia, please," she whispered. "Do not make this harder." The Duke stopped, frozen, helpless. Helplessness was not something he had ever learned to bear. She turned toward the door. He felt the moment slipping from his grasp. Something fragile, something vital. "Aurelia," he said, his voice breaking in the smallest, rawest way. "Will you return to London?" She paused at the threshold, turned, and answered with quiet devastation, "I do not know." Then she left. Duke stood rooted to the floor, breath halted, heart suspended. The room continued murmuring around him, but the world had shifted. He felt the cliff open beneath his feet. She was gone. Not socially, not emotionally, but physically gone, leaving him with the terrifying truth. If fate wished to take her forever, there would be nothing left he could do. And for the first time, for the first shattering time, the Duke of Ravensfield realized he was no longer afraid of loving her. He was terrified of losing her. The journey to Hawthorne Manor had taken nearly 4 hours, each mile sinking deeper into the Duke of Ravensfield's chest like a weight he could not lift. The snow had thickened with every passing field, blanketing the countryside in a silent, unforgiving whiteness. The carriage windows fogged from his breath, but he did not look away from them. He kept his gaze fixed on the blurred world outside, as if the landscape could steady the relentless turmoil inside him. Aurelia had left. London 2 nights earlier. He had not slept since. He had tried with every fragment of discipline bred into him, to remain in London, to be dignified, to be patient, to trust that she would send word. But hours had passed with no letter, no message, no sign. And somewhere between dusk and dawn he realized with devastating clarity that this separation was unlike the others. This was not distance born of pride or misunderstanding. This was fear. This was loss suspended on a thread. He remembered the look in her eyes as she read the letter about her mother, the sudden vulnerability, the tremor in her voice, the way she refused aid, not out of pride, but out of desperation. He had never seen her look like that, not even when he had wounded her years ago. It was that expression that haunted him. It was that expression that drove him here. As the carriage slowed before the gates of Hawthorne Manor, the Duke felt his breath catch, not in anticipation, but in dread. He had not been here since Cedric's departure. The estate held memories he had never confronted, memories of family fractures and whispered regrets, but none of that mattered now. The only thing that mattered was Aurelia. The gates opened slowly, too slowly. When the carriage stopped, Ravensfield stepped out before the footman could assist him. The cold cut at his face, but he did not flinch. He climbed the stone steps 2 at a time and knocked once, firm, steady, restrained. His gloves were still dusted with frost when the door opened. A young maid greeted him, startled. "Your Grace, is Lady Aurelia home?" His voice was quiet, but carried the force of a man at the edge of breaking. "She is, Your Grace. The maid hesitated. "She is in her mother's room." He felt the air leave his lungs. "Is Lady Hawthorne?" The maid lowered her gaze. "She rests. She is weak. Lady Aurelia has not left her side." He nodded once. "Announce me." The maid hurried inside. Ravensfield removed his gloves slowly, breathing deeply as though preparing for battle, not against others but against the walls inside himself. When the maid returned, she curtsied. "My lady will see you in the downstairs parlor." Not her room, not the hallway outside her mother's door. A parlor, a controlled space, a boundary. He deserved no more. The Duke followed the maid through the quiet corridors. The house smelled faintly of lavender and medicine. Every lamp seemed too dim. Every curtain was drawn. A heavy stillness settled over the home, the kind that accompanies waiting, uncertainty, and grief. When the maid opened the parlor door, Aurelia stood by the fireplace. She looked exhausted, utterly, painfully exhausted. Her hair was loosely pinned, strands falling against her cheeks. The dark circles beneath her eyes betrayed nights without sleep. Her gown was simple, as though chosen without thought, and she held a folded handkerchief lightly in one hand. But even in her weariness, she held herself with quiet dignity. "Aurelia," he breathed. She did not turn fully, only looked at him out of the corner of her eye. "Your Grace." The two words struck him harder than any blow. He stepped forward, hesitated, then stopped a respectful distance away. "I came," he said softly. "I see that." Silence followed, long, fragile, stretching between them like a trembling ribbon. He swallowed. "I received no word from you." She looked down. "I have been occupied. With your mother." "Yes." He nodded, unable to find breath for anything else. "How is she?" "Unwell," Aurelia whispered. "The physician believes the illness progressed for longer than she admitted." Pain moved through her features, quiet, controlled, but deep. The Duke's chest tightened. "I am sorry," he said, and the sincerity in his tone surprised even him. She nodded faintly. "Thank you." His gaze moved to her trembling hands. "Aurelia, I know this is not the moment you wish to see me." "No," she said softly. "It is not." He closed his eyes briefly. "But I had to come." "Why?" Her voice cracked on the word, barely audible. He opened his eyes again, eyes that for once held no pride, no armor, only a raw truth he had never allowed himself to feel. "Because I feared I had lost you." Aurelia inhaled sharply. He continued before she could speak. "Because I feared that I had wasted too many chances, and that if I allowed distance to grow again, I would never find the courage to say what I must." Her fingers tightened around the handkerchief. "Your Grace, I cannot—" "No." His voice was quiet, firm. She froze. He stepped closer, not close enough to touch her, but close enough for her to feel the gravity in his voice. "Aurelia," he said, "you may refuse every thought I offer. You may choose to turn away from me for the rest of your life. But do not deny me the chance to speak the truth I should have spoken long ago." She trembled slightly, her breath unsteady. He took a careful breath, a breath that tasted of fear. "I have been," he said, "a coward." Her gaze snapped to his. He continued, "I hid behind pride, behind silence, behind the walls built by generations of men who taught me that emotion was weakness. I believed distance protected me. I believed restraint was virtue. But all it did," his voice faltered, "all it did was wound you and imprison me." Aurelia's lips parted, but she did not speak. He pressed on, voice thickening. "At Cullenworth, I acted from fear. At Penbury's soiree, I acted from jealousy. And for years before that, I acted from ignorance." Her eyes shone, not with tears, but with the weight of memory. He swallowed hard. "I cannot ask you to forget it. I cannot ask you to forgive it. But I can tell you the truth," Aurelia whispered, barely breathing. "And what is that truth?" He exhaled slowly, painfully. "That the sight of you walking away from me," he paused, searching for breath, "is the only thing I have ever been truly afraid of." Aurelia's throat constricted. "Your Grace, say my—" "Name," he murmured. His voice broke for the first time. "Please." She closed her eyes. "Ravensfield." He flinched. "My name." A long, trembling moment passed. Then, "Edmund," she whispered. He felt something shatter inside him, something that had been solid for years, something that had kept him frozen. "Aurelia," he said softly, stepping closer. "I did not come here to demand anything from you. I came because I could not remain in London knowing you were suffering, alone." A tear slipped down her cheek, not from romance, not from longing, but from exhaustion and fear. She wiped it quickly, embarrassed. He looked away, giving her dignity, his jaw clenching with the effort not to reach for her. After a long moment, she spoke. "My mother may not recover." He bowed his head. "Then let me help you." "I do not know how," she whispered. "I do." She lifted trembling eyes to him. "I will remain here," he said quietly, "if you allow it. Not as a duke, not as a man seeking redemption, but simply, as someone who refuses to abandon you. Aurelia shook her head softly. I cannot ask that of you. You need not ask. He hesitated. Unless you wish me to leave. Her breath caught. She did not ask him to leave. Instead, she stepped back, collapsing gently into the chair beside the fireplace. Her hands covered her face, not in dramatic sobbing, but in the silent collapse of a woman who had carried too much alone. The Duke approached, carefully, reverently, and knelt. Kneeling was not natural to him. It was not expected. It was not dignified. But he knelt anyway. Aurelia, he said, voice breaking, you do not have to face this alone. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, she let her barriers soften. She looked at him with eyes trembling under the weight of fear, sorrow, and a fragile hope she tried desperately to suppress. She whispered, I do not know if I can trust you. His reply came without hesitation. Quiet, steady, certain. Then let me earn it. Her lips trembled. I am afraid. So am I. The admission was quiet, devastating, undeniably true. Aurelia stared at him, truly stared, seeing not the Duke, not the title, not the man of pride, but the man beneath the armor. The man who had loved in silence, the man who had broken and was trying to mend, the man who was kneeling not out of duty but out of choice. She reached forward, and for the briefest moment, her hand hovered above his cheek, trembling with hesitation. Then she touched him. It was the gentlest touch he had ever felt. A breath escaped him, almost a sob, though he contained it with all the dignity he had left. Edmund, she whispered. He closed his eyes. Yes. I need time. He nodded. You shall have it. Every day you wish. And you will stay, if you want me to. A long pause. A devastating, breathless pause. Then she whispered, yes. In that moment, fragile, trembling, quiet, the distance between them closed not with declarations, not with passion, not with dramatic promises, but with truth, with vulnerability, with the first step toward healing. He rose slowly and took the seat beside her, not touching her, not overstepping, not claiming anything, but simply being there, present, unmoving, devoted. For the first time, Aurelia did not push him away. She leaned her head gently against his shoulder, and the Duke, Edmund, closed his eyes as the fire warmed the room, feeling a soft, fragile hope take shape inside his chest. Not victory, not certainty, not forgiveness, but possibility, a beginning. And outside, the snow continued to fall quietly, gently, as though blessing the confession he had carried in his heart for far too long.